The sun was setting when Ayasta returned from the hunt, his leather boots stepping softly over the dry leaves that covered the forest floor. Winter had been harsh, and even with spring's arrival, hunger still haunted his small Cherokee village in the Western Territories. He carried only 2 thin rabbits tied to his belt, the result of 3 days of fruitless searching through the rocky mountains that surrounded his people's new settlement. The low sound of crying made him stop abruptly. Ayasta raised his head, sharpening his ears to locate the source of that lament echoing through the trees. It was a female voice, young, laden with a pain he recognized all too well. He followed the sound cautiously, moving between the pine trees until he reached a small clearing where some stones had been carefully arranged over a mound of fresh earth. There, kneeling before the makeshift grave, was a girl of perhaps 15 years. Her black hair fell in undone braids over her shoulders, and her torn clothes revealed days of abandonment and suffering. She wept silently, her small hands trembling as she placed wildflowers upon the turned earth. Ayasta hesitated before approaching, recognizing the sanctity of that moment of mourning. The girl raised her eyes upon sensing his presence, and Ayasta felt a tightness in his chest, seeing the despair stamped on that childlike face. Her dark eyes gleamed with tears, but there was something deeper there, a loneliness that seemed to consume her soul. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his intentions, and then, with a weak and trembling voice, murmured a single word that made Ayasta's heart stop. "Father." He remained motionless, trying to process what he had just heard. The girl continued to gaze at him with desperate hope, as if his mere presence could somehow bring back everything she had lost. Ayasta looked at the grave, instinctively understanding that there lay someone very important to that solitary child, and that his arrival at that moment was not mere coincidence, but perhaps the last thread of hope to which she could cling. Ayasta knelt slowly before the girl, maintaining a respectful distance while observing her face marked by suffering. She did not look away from him, as if fearing he might disappear if she blinked. The silence between them was filled only by the whisper of wind through the leaves and the distant sound of a stream running near the clearing. He noticed the marks of dried tears on her cheeks and the way her lips trembled, not just from cold, but from contained emotion. The grave was simple, yet carefully prepared. Stones from the stream had been arranged in a perfect circle, and small personal objects, a bone knife, wooden beads, a piece of colored fabric, were scattered over the earth as offerings. Ayasta recognized the mourning rituals of his people, but there was something different about that grave, something that suggested whoever had prepared it was too young to know all the appropriate traditions. She extended a trembling hand toward him, and Ayasta felt a stab of pain seeing how thin and pale her fingers were, clear signs of malnutrition. Her clothes, which must have once been beautiful, now hung loose on her skeletal body. It was evident she had spent days, perhaps weeks, alone in that forest, tending to that tomb and slowly wasting away. The determination in her eyes, however, showed that she would not abandon that place, even if it meant her own death. Ayasta slowly removed one of the rabbits from his belt and extended it to her. The girl looked at the dead animal with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation, as if unsure whether she should accept the offering. Her hands trembled when she finally reached for the game, and she held it against her chest as if it were the most precious gift she had ever received. In that simple gesture, Ayasta saw not just physical hunger, but a much deeper emotional hunger, the desperate need for care and protection. When she raised her eyes to him again, there was a silent question in her gaze. Ayasta understood that she was not just asking for food, but pleading not to be abandoned again. The weight of that unexpected responsibility hit him like an arrow to the chest, and he knew in that moment that he could not simply walk away and leave her to die alone in that solitary clearing. Ayasta built a small fire with dry branches, while the girl watched each of his movements with silent attention. She had seated herself on the opposite side of the grave, as if wanting to keep the tomb between them and him, a sacred barrier that could not be crossed. Her hand still held the rabbit, but she had made no move to prepare it, as if she didn't know where to begin or as if she were waiting for his permission. The fire grew slowly, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Ayasta removed his hunting knife and began to prepare the rabbit, his movements precise and efficient from years of experience. She watched him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were memorizing every detail of his appearance. From time to time, her eyes would drift to the grave, and he could see the internal struggle she waged between the need for survival and loyalty to the dead. When the meat began to cook, the aroma spread through the clearing, and Ayasta heard the girl's stomach growling audibly. She blushed with shame and pressed her hands against her abdomen, trying to silence the sounds of hunger. He cut a piece of the barely cooked meat and offered it to her, watching how her hands trembled as she accepted it. She ate with the voraciousness of someone who hadn't seen food in days, but stopped frequently to look at the tomb, as if asking permission from the dead to continue living. While she satisfied her hunger, Ayasta studied the grave more carefully. The earth was fresh, indicating that death had occurred just days ago. The objects left as offerings were simple, but carried the weight of deep devotion. A small corn-husk doll, clearly made with care, was positioned near the head, suggesting that whoever lay there had been not just loved, but cared for by someone very young. The realization that this girl had lost her last connection to the world hit him like a physical blow. When she finished eating, she carefully cleaned her fingers on the grass and bowed respectfully before the grave. Ayasta saw fresh tears spring to her eyes, but this time they seemed different, no longer tears of despair but of gratitude. She murmured low words in Cherokee, a prayer or perhaps a promise, and then looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and fear, as if she knew that this moment of care might be the last she would receive. Night fell over the clearing like a heavy blanket, and Ayasta realized that the girl had no intention of leaving that place. She had wrapped herself in a tattered blanket and positioned herself at the foot of the grave, like a silent guardian protecting the dead. Her eyelids were heavy with exhaustion, but she fought against sleep, as if fearing that something terrible might happen if she lowered her guard for an instant. Ayasta fed the fire with more wood and sat at a respectful distance, observing her discreetly. She whispered low words to the tomb, stories or memories that he couldn't discern completely, but that carried a tone of intimacy and longing that moved him deeply. Her small hands caressed the earth as if she were consoling someone, and he understood that, in her mind, whoever was buried there could still hear her. When the night's cold intensified, Ayasta removed his own blanket and approached cautiously. She watched him with wide eyes, ready to flee if he made any threatening movement. He placed the blanket over her trembling shoulders and immediately stepped back, showing that he had no intentions beyond offering comfort. She pulled the warm fabric against her body and murmured something that sounded like gratitude, but her eyes never stopped watching his every movement. The hours passed slowly, and Ayasta began to notice details he had missed in daylight. The girl had a small scar on her forehead, barely visible under her hair fringe, and her hands were calloused from hard work, signs that she had lived a difficult life even before finding herself alone. When she finally yielded to sleep, her body relaxed only partially, as if even unconsciously she remained alert to danger. Ayasta understood that this child had learned to survive in a hostile world, but that her resistance was reaching its end. He spent the night in vigil, feeding the fire and watching the girl's irregular breathing. Several times she stirred in dreams, murmuring words that sounded like pleas or calls for someone who would never answer again. Ayasta felt a growing responsibility form in his chest, an understanding that this child had been placed in his path for a reason he still couldn't completely comprehend, but that he could not ignore. Dawn brought a soft light that filtered through the treetops, revealing the dew that had accumulated over the grave during the night. The girl awakened slowly, her eyes moving instinctively to check if Ayasta was still there. When she found him sitting near the nearly extinguished fire, an expression of relief crossed her face, as if she had expected to wake up alone again. Ayasta had prepared the rest of the rabbit meat and offered a portion to her without words. She accepted with silent reverence, but before eating she placed a small piece of the meat on the grave. He watched the ritual with respect, understanding that she was sharing her meal with the dead, keeping alive the connection she refused to abandon. The simplicity and purity of that gesture touched something deep in his soul. After eating, she approached him timidly and extended her hand to lightly touch his arm. When he didn't pull away, She pressed her palm against his skin, as if wanting to confirm that he was real and not an illusion created by her desperate mind. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude, not despair. She murmured a single word in Cherokee that Ayasta recognized as "thank you," and the weight of emotion in her voice nearly brought him to his knees. Ayasta knew he couldn't leave her there to die, but he also understood that forcing her to abandon that place would be a cruelty. He stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, gesturing for her to follow. When she shook her head negatively, he returned and knelt beside the grave, placing his own hand on the fresh earth. He looked into her eyes and nodded, a silent promise that he would respect her vigil and not force her to leave. The understanding between them was instantaneous and profound. She threw herself against his chest, sobbing as if all the tears she had contained finally found a safe place to be shed. Ayasta embraced her carefully, feeling how her small and fragile body fit perfectly against his. In that moment, without words or explanations, she became his daughter, and he became the father she had lost, united by a shared pain and a mutual need for healing. Days turned into weeks, and Ayasta established a routine that honored both the girl's needs and his own responsibility to the village. Every morning he would leave to hunt, always returning to the clearing before nightfall to find her still maintaining her silent vigil. She had begun to take better care of herself, braiding her hair and washing her face in the nearby stream, but she never strayed far from the grave, as if an invisible rope kept her bound to that sacred place. Ayasta brought supplies from the village, fabrics to make new clothes, medicinal herbs to strengthen her weakened health, and simple tools to make her life in the forest more comfortable. She accepted everything with silent gratitude, but he perceived that she was torn between the need to survive and the guilt of continuing to live while those she loved had departed. Her nights were frequently interrupted by nightmares, and she would wake calling for someone who would never answer again. Gradually, she began to communicate more with him, not through words, but through small gestures of affection and trust. She would prepare his food when he returned from hunting, arrange his belongings when he slept, and sometimes place wildflowers beside his boots as an offering of gratitude. Ayasta understood that she was trying to repay his care in the only way she knew how, creating an improvised family around that solitary tomb. One afternoon, while watching Ayasta repair a trap, she approached and placed her small hand over his. When he looked at her, he saw that her eyes had changed. They still carried sadness, but there was also a spark of something resembling peace. She pointed to the grave and then to him, and Ayasta understood that she was trying to tell him that whoever was buried there would approve of his presence. It was a moment of acceptance that both needed, a silent blessing that would allow their relationship to grow beyond immediate necessity. That night, for the first time since he had found her, she moved a few steps away from the grave to sit beside him by the fire. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the mutual understanding that they had found in each other something both thought they had lost forever. Ayasta felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years, and she, in turn, seemed to have found the strength to continue living, even while carrying her pain. The changing seasons brought with them a subtle but profound transformation in the dynamic between Ayasta and the girl. Summer had arrived in full force, and the forest around the clearing exploded with life. Wildflowers painted the ground with vibrant colors, and the nearby stream sang with greater intensity. She had begun to explore the immediate surroundings, always keeping the grave within her line of sight, collecting medicinal herbs and berries she recognized as safe for consumption. Ayasta watched this evolution with a mixture of pride and concern. She was becoming physically stronger. Her cheeks had regained color and her movements were firmer and more decisive, but he also perceived that she was preparing for something, as if she were gathering strength for an important decision. Her visits to the grave had become longer and more intense, and he frequently found her whispering elaborate conversations with whoever lay there, as if she were asking for advice or permission for something. One morning, Ayasta awoke to find her sitting beside the grave with a small bundle of belongings arranged at her side. She had braided wildflowers into her hair and worn the cleanest dress she possessed. When he approached, she raised her eyes to him with an expression that mixed determination and sadness. She pointed to the grave, then to him, and finally toward the direction of the distant village. And Ayasta understood that she had made the decision to leave that place. The farewell ritual was simple but deeply moving. She placed her hands on the earth one last time, whispering words that sounded like promises and farewells. Her tears fell upon the flowers she had left as a final offering, and Ayasta felt his own heart tighten, witnessing the courage she needed to gather to take that step. When she stood and extended her hand to him, her eyes shone with a resolution he had never seen before. They walked together out of the clearing, and Ayasta noticed that she looked back only once. There was no despair in her gaze, but a serene acceptance, as if she had finally found the strength to carry her pain without being crushed by it. He understood that those months in the forest had not been just about survival, but about learning to live with loss, and that she had emerged from that experience not as the broken girl he had found, but as a young woman who had discovered her own resilience. The Cherokee village received Ayasta and his adopted daughter with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. The older women immediately recognized the signs of deep mourning in the girl's eyes, and without asking questions, they welcomed her into their circles of work and care. She adapted to community life with silent grace, contributing her knowledge of medicinal herbs and her skill with handwork, but always maintaining a respectful reserve that everyone understood and honored. Ayasta watched with growing pride as she flourished in the village environment. She had found her place among the other young women, teaching them ancient songs she had learned in her previous life, and learning from them new skills that helped her feel useful and valued. Her relationship with him had evolved into something beautiful and natural. She treated him with the respect and affection of a true daughter, and he protected and guided her with the dedication of a father who had chosen to love. The seasons passed, and the girl grew to become a respected young woman in the community. She never forgot those she had lost, but learned to carry their memory as a blessing instead of a curse. Ayasta frequently found her at sunset, sitting at the village's edge looking toward the distant forest, and he knew she was sending loving thoughts to the clearing where it all began. When the time finally came for her union with a young warrior of the tribe, she approached Ayasta with eyes full of tears of gratitude. She placed her hands over his heart and whispered the first complete words he had heard her speak. "You taught me that it's possible to find a new family without forgetting the old one." Ayasta felt a completeness he had never experienced before, understanding that saving that girl had, in fact, saved himself. On the night before her wedding ceremony, Ayasta and she walked together to the forest's edge. She placed a crown of wildflowers on his head and looked toward the distant clearing, whispering one last prayer of gratitude for those who had departed. When she turned to him, her eyes shone with the wisdom of someone who had learned that true love transcends death, and that family is not just about blood, but about the choice to care for one another even in the darkest moments. Ayasta knew that the legacy of that chance encounter in the forest would spread through generations, a story of how compassion can transform tragedy into hope, and how two broken hearts can heal by uniting in love. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.